Hello folks, this is Scott with Dallas Paint Correction and Auto Detailing. I'm going to make a video on how to clean an engine bay. Now, I'm standing next to the camera and I'm just going to have you stare at the engine bay here, and I'm going to go over a couple of points with you before I actually begin to clean and detail this engine. And there's some important points to consider. One of the first questions that most of my customers will ask me is, Scott, how safe is it to run or use free-flowing water inside the engine bay? Now, it's a great question because most of us may be thinking about some of the electrical components on the vehicle, whether it be the alternator or some of the connections all around the vehicle. How safe is it to get water inside these components? Well, here's the deal, and some common sense has to be applied here. When we're talking about using free-flowing water and using some form of degreaser to clean this engine, yes, we have to apply some common sense. Some of these connections, though, on modern day engines are what's called, they're not waterproof, they're not 100% watertight, but what manufacturers do today with modern day engines is they're called splash proof rated. Now, most of the connections on this engine here, this happens to be a 2016 Lexus, I think it's an ES350. This engine's not overly dirty. It's just got about 10 or 12,000 miles on it. It's got dust and dirt. It's got some, it needs a little bit of attention, and then I'm going to dress it, and it's going to look absolutely perfect and absolutely new. Heck, it's probably going to look better than the day that I bought the vehicle. But here's the deal. When it comes to using free-flowing water, you don't really have to overthink it, but you got to use some common sense here. There are guys that will use a power washer. I'm not a huge fan of using a power washer. That doesn't mean I won't choose to use them from time to time. There are times here in Texas, I have customers that have some pretty big trucks, and they like to go 4x4, or they want to go off-roading, and they'll get a lot of that Texas mud and clay inside the engine compartment. Now, all bets are off, and just using a hose with a nozzle to get that stuff off can be very difficult. I will use a power washer at that time, but the power washer I choose to use is low pressure. It's only about 1500 psi, and I use a special nozzle on the end of it that knocks down the pressure to about 1000 psi. But I'm going to use common sense. I'm not going to apply that power washer or get really close with the nozzle to any components on this engine. I'm going to back up a little bit and just use that pressure to be able to knock down that dirt so that I can clean the engine. But as far as using free-flowing water and whether it's dangerous, it's really not the case. Most of the fuse boxes in this car, whether it be the relay and fuse box over here on the passenger side or on the driver's side, they're sealed, they're covered. They got a little rubber seal around the tops of these fuse boxes for the most part with modern day engines, and the amount of water I'm going to use is really going to be insignificant. I usually tell my customers, and I give them a scenario, if you left the hood open to your car, let's say overnight, and it happened to rain, most of us would walk outside our home to get ready to go to work or whatever the case may be, and we'd realize that we had the hood open. And we would go, oh, I'm an idiot, I left the hood open. But for the most part, none of us are going to run back into the home, pick up the phone and call the dealer or your local mechanic and say, I completely screwed up, I left the hood open, it rained, and now my engine's wet, and I need you to come tow it to your place and fix it. That's just not going to be the case. Most of us are going to close the hood, start the car, and go about our business. And the amount of free-flowing water I'm going to use on this engine bay today is probably going to be less water than if I left the hood open and it rained, so it's really not a big issue. The other thing I want to bring into the video is when we're using a certain type of degreaser or cleaner, and I'm going to highlight a very popular cleaner when it comes to engine bay cleaning, and a lot of people grab this stuff over the counter. This stuff is called gunk. Now, I'm not a huge fan of this stuff. I tell you what, it's really effective at being able to break down some of the grease and grime on this engine. But when it comes to cleaning an engine for me, I want to use a chemical or a degreaser that rinses freely. This stuff made by gunk, again, it will break down the grease and grime. You can agitate it with a brush and break down some of that stuff. But you'll notice when you use free-flowing water or a power washer, however you choose to do it, this stuff doesn't rinse all that freely. This can become an issue. You have an alternator on this car, but if you looked at this engine now, and again, I apologize, but this video is going to be a little bit lengthy. There's a lot of stuff to cover. So if you really want to learn how to do it, how I do it as a professional, and you want to attempt it on your own, there's so many factors that come into play. So I'm going to kind of leave this video running so you have all the information you need to be able to do it safely and effectively. But when it comes to the alternator, and if you look at engine bays today, the engine bays are getting, well, they're getting tinier. The engines are getting bigger. There's more and more components being put inside these engines where it's getting to the point it's almost impossible to be able to work on them on your own. You just can't get in these things anymore. And most of the alternators today, because that's one issue, people say, can the alternator get wet? Well, this particular car, this Lexus, has a Nippon Denso Japanese-made alternator. It happens to be in the front of the engine, but down towards the middle, almost the bottom side of the engine. That alternator was rated, again, to be splash-proof rated. It can get wet. It can get moisture inside of it. It's okay. But here's the deal. If you're using this type of product, this gunk product, that doesn't rinse freely, what can happen is if you spray this all over the engine bay and start agitating and start rinsing off the engine, because this stuff is kind of, it almost feels like a petroleum product, a solvent product. It doesn't rinse freely. It stays kind of slimy. Some of that product can get inside the alternator and actually start gunking up around the brushes. So this is where I am not a huge fan of this. I do not recommend these type of engine cleaners, although I know they're all over the place. Some people have used them, haven't had issues. But if you're using this on a regular basis, say you wanted to clean your engine bay twice a year, you could potentially, because this stuff doesn't rinse freely, it could start to get in some areas like inside the alternator and kind of gunk up. And I don't mean to pick on its name, but that's kind of what it's going to do. So I want to use a degreaser on this engine that has the ability to cut all the grease and grime, and when I hit it with free-flowing water, I want it to rinse completely off the engine and fall to the driveway. I don't want it to cake up or gunk up on any type of component, especially the alternator. So that's a little bit of a point I wanted to bring out with some of these cleaners and why I don't like to use them. They don't rinse freely. But as far as running water on this engine, it's really not going to be a big issue. The other thing I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight the nozzle that I like, and most of you are going to notice it and go, boy, I probably have one of these in my garage. This is the nozzle I choose to use on the end of a hose. This is an old-timey garden hose nozzle. Now, what's great about this is I get to control the amount of pressure that comes through this nozzle and also how much water I'm actually introducing to the engine compartment. And I can just do that by simply squeezing the nozzle lightly, or I can push it all the way forward and I have more pressure, more water. Now there's times I want full pressure, maybe on areas where it's not as critical, it's not going to be as dangerous to put a lot of water on, maybe on top of the strut towers here or on the sides of the engine. But I'm not going to take high pressure and blow it into the air intake or something like that, where water could eventually get into the air box and get the air filter wet. So again, when it comes to cleaning engine bays, you gotta use some common sense. Just lightly spraying it down isn't going to do a thing. It's not going to hurt anything. All the components are splash-proof rated. All the connections also have dielectric grease within them that repels moisture from getting inside the connection, so it's not going to hurt anything. But I'm going to show you the product that I like to use, and this happens to be, again, you probably have heard me talk about this product before. It's called Super Degreaser by Meguiar's. This stuff is incredibly effective of breaking down grease. It free rinses or rinses freely. It doesn't leave a lot of residue. It doesn't get caked up. When I spray water on it, it will completely rinse freely and fall to the driveway. So I'm going to leave this camera running and I'm going to actually clean this engine bay. Now for me, when I do the engine bay, I of course want to do the whole engine area around the jams, the front of the plastic here. I also want to include under the hood, and I want to bring up a point about this particular hood here. Most hoods, most modern day vehicles will have what they call a hood blanket. Now this is a heat blanket, so when the engine gets hot, that engine heat is not transferring through the surface of the hood and getting the top of the hood awfully hot. It's just a heat blanket. These things are made out of some type of felt material. I don't know what it's made out of, but it's made out of, it looks like felt to me. Now, depending on how dirty your hood blanket is, you have to apply some common sense. Even though this is a Lexus, it's an ES350, some would consider a Lexus a high-end vehicle, but again, they make cars today with some of the components in them rather cheaply. This hood blanket is just fastened in with these little plastic clips. Now, if I get this thing wet and it gets overly saturated, it can become heavy and it can actually start to hang and pull some of those plastic tabs off. So when I look at this one here, I actually see that it's not overly dirty. I may choose to just spray some cleaner on a microfiber towel and just wipe the hood blanket down. I don't necessarily have to shoot free-flowing water inside that blanket and get it overly wet. But because I got to clean all the way around the jambs here, it's going to get wet. But there's going to be a step after I clean this engine bay. I'm actually going to dry that hood blanket so that it's not heavy, it's not overly saturated, it's not going to become an issue. Again, this video might be a little bit long, but if you're looking to learn how to detail your engine bay and clean it, it's going to take a little bit of time, so I'm just going to leave the camera running. So I'm going to go ahead and start breaking down some of the grease and grime. And for me, I start with the hood first, underneath the hood, because as I clean this dirty stuff on this hood is going to fall on the engine. I don't want to dial this engine in and have it all clean and then have all this grease and grime and junk falling off the top of from the underside of this hood back onto a clean engine. It doesn't make sense. So I want to use the appropriate steps as I go through this, so I'm not creating more work for myself. So it's going to look this way. I'm going to take my Meguiar's Super Degreaser and simply just spray around the edges of the under the hood. And the next thing I'm going to use, you've heard me talk about this before in my videos. This is a brush made by Nanoskin. It's a salt and pepper flag tip brush. It's incredibly gentle. It's not going to hurt any of the painted surfaces around the car. And I'm just simply going to get it a little bit wet with my cleaner. And then I'm going to go in and clean the underside of this hood. Now, another point I want to make during this video, when you're using the cleaner and the Super Degreaser or whatever cleaner you choose to use, you don't want it to dry on the surface. So you want to work rather quickly, break down this grease and grime, and then rinse it off. So now that I've cleaned the underside of that hood, I'm just going to rinse it off and use very little pressure. I'm going to use this nozzle and I'm going to squeeze lightly just to give me enough water to rinse it off. Now again, I've gotten that hood blanket wet, but I'm going to dry it here, but I'm not necessarily shooting water onto that blanket because it's not overly dirty. I'm going to kind of avoid it for now. But if it was dirty, I can clean it. But again, it's a case-by-case basis. Now, right around this hood latch, hopefully the video is picking it up, there's some grease and grime here right around this hood latch that didn't get picked up or eaten away with the Super Degreaser. There's another product I want to kind of highlight, and it's called Citro. This is an orange degreaser, incredibly effective. of breaking down some really tough grease and grime. So I'm going to use this. This product is a little bit difficult to find. You can find it at some of your more high-end parts stores. Napa actually carries it. It just depends on the Napa. You can find it online, but it's called Citral. It's their orange degreaser. And I'm going to spray it on this area here that was a little bit difficult for the super degreaser to cut through. And I'm simply going to come in with a brush. And break down that grease and grime. And then I'll rinse it off. And again, the Citral, it's an organic, all-natural degreaser, and it rinses freely. There's not a lot of residue. It doesn't get overly heavy when it gets wet. So it's really, really good for the engine bay compartment too, because it rinses freely. Now, I'm going to get inside the engine compartment here, inside the engine bay, and actually start cleaning this engine bay. And I'm just going to spray